After doing over 16 episodes on China, 10 on early modern Europe, 3 on America, 3 on North Korea, 1 on Japan, and heck, even 1 on Uganda, I finally get to do my own country. I've been looking forward to this.
Hello there.
Okay, so in episode 5 of Enemies of the West, interestingly, we're not looking at a communist nation, a military dictatorship, or even a warlord. We're actually looking at someone from the West, Gough Whitlam. Now, I'm sure you're wondering, what did he actually do? Leak documents to the Soviet Union, praise Kim Il-sung, support Palestine? What did he actually do to make himself an enemy of the West? And I'm going to leave that one up to you to decide. But what we will see in this video is certainly that the West wanted his political head, and that he was a despised name in both the CIA and MI6. And before you click off thinking, I came here to learn history from a teacher, not watch Alex Jones, we had a whole court case last year where the Australian High Court deemed that the National Archive was illegally classifying documents at the behest of the royal family. This isn't conspiracy theory territory anymore. This is confirmed. The West wanted our own Prime Minister gone. So for context, in Australia we have two main parties. The Labor Party, which represents unions, and the Coalition, which is a combination of the Liberal Party and the National Party, who also used to be called the Country Party. And these guys represent business interests. Typically, Liberal is viewed as centre-right. I know, Australia's opposite land. And Labor is viewed as centre-left. But I don't even think it's as ideological as that. Business councils tend to donate more towards the Liberals, and as the name suggests, unions certainly donate more towards Labor. Now, for the first half of the 20th century, Labor had been the dominant party and was in power for both world wars. But afterwards, the Liberals gained a foothold as the dominant party and had 23 straight years of power. And given that their message was to conserve what Australia had, and the fact that they had a very strong anti-communist stance, meant that they were incredibly popular in the 1950s. However, their message started to go stale in the 1960s, and when Australia joined the USA in fighting in Vietnam, they lost a lot of support. And so in 1972, Gough Whitlam led Labor to their first election victory since 1949, and he was a very popular campaigner. He was charismatic, something of a straight shooter, and he had a very real vision of what changes Australia could make to prosper in the late 20th century. By all accounts, and as with many big personalities, he was extremely difficult to work with, but a combination of his policies and charisma really endeared him to Australians. I'll very briefly walk you through his policy changes, but this really could be an hour-long podcast in itself, and he pretty much made more changes in 3 years than the Liberals did in 23. He continued with Australia's withdrawal from the Vietnam War, which started under John Gorton in 1970. He instituted a policy of self-determination for Indigenous people. Previously, the government had an assimilation policy where Indigenous people were expected to conform to an anglicised culture. And so in the late Whitlam era, some Indigenous groups were given small plots of land to have determination over. He abolished all university fees, which many argue is about individual equality. I think Whitlam viewed it more as a national investment and in making sure that no experts slipped through the cracks. He also opened up Australia to Southeast Asia. A month after his election, Australia reopened its embassy in Peking and he became the first Australian Prime Minister to visit China since Mao took power. And he opened trade with Indonesia and Korea. In what most would consider as irrelevant ceremonial policy, he wanted to replace God Save the Queen with an Australian national anthem. He abolished royal honours like knightings, and his Labor government passed a law which removed Defender of the Faith as one of the Queen's titles in Australia as head of the Church of England. Like I said, most would consider this pretty irrelevant, but this movement towards a republic in Australia certainly didn't sit well with London. He also annoyed the Americans pretty badly. America had a surveillance base called Pine Gap that was used to spy on the Chinese. Whitlam learned that they were breaking the agreement and not using it to spy on the Chinese, but in fact using it to identify bombing points against Cambodia, and so Whitlam threatened them with closing it down. Now, Richard Nixon had appointed a guy called Marshall Green to be the ambassador to Australia. This was a guy who's since been widely criticised for supporting Suharto's coup against Sukarno in Indonesia during the 1960s. Australia's Minister for Science and Consumer Affairs, Clyde Cameron, met with Green and floated the idea of nationalising industries in which American corporations had huge investment. According to Cameron, Green's response was, well, we'd just move in. Cameron has also accused MI6 of bugging Parliament and relaying it to the CIA, and we know that the CIA used a third party, Nukenhen Bank, to launder $24 million in donations to the Liberal Party to defeat Gough Whitlam in the upcoming 1976 election. But more on that later. Now, in the early 1970s, it was customary for a supply bill to be passed which would authorise government spending before a budget was approved. But by 1975, there was a slight issue for Whitlam. Since Labor's re-election in 1974, 2 Labor senators had resigned their post and were replaced with Liberal senators. We have a rule where if a senator resigns mid-term, the Premier of the state the senator's from chooses their replacement. And so when Labor senators from New South Wales resigned, the Liberal New South Wales Premier was all too eager to appoint Liberal replacements. This meant that the Senate was split. There were even numbers of Liberal and Labor senators with 2 independents. One of those independents agreed to vote with the Libs, and one agreed to vote with Labor. So when the supply bill came to the Senate, Labor didn't have a majority to pass it. And so this was a sticky situation for Whitlam. Any bill passed by his parliament could be blocked by the Libs in the Senate. We basically didn't have a government. And so this is where John Kerr enters. Now, John Kerr had the title of what we call in Australia as the Governor General. And the job description of this title is hotly contested by constitutional lawyers, but basically they're the go-between between the Queen and the Prime Minister. And Whitlam certainly saw Kerr's job as just to pass on Whitlam's advice to the Queen. Some consider it to be a purely ceremonial title, while others consider it to be a title that has actual power. Kerr certainly viewed it as one with actual power, and we now know from declassified documents that the Crown did too. An Australian historian called Jenny Hocking tried to get access to letters between Kerr and Queen Elizabeth's secretary, Martin Charteris, nearly 10 years ago. She should have had access because it had been over 30 years since they were authored, but the National Archives refused, arguing that they were personal and not government documents, and that as personal authors, the Crown wished for them not to be released. The case went all the way to our High Court, and just last year in 2020, the High Court ordered the archives to release them. The letters are pretty damning on the British's part and reveal that the Crown was subtly nudging Kerr towards sacking Gough Whitlam, a power that many considered to be something that went beyond the scope of what the Governor-General should really be doing. You can find out all the correspondence in this book here, and I strongly encourage you to do so. But some of the highlights were these. In September of 1975, after it became obvious that supply wasn't getting through, Kerr wrote in his journal that he spoke to Prince Charles and was considering sacking Whitlam. In letters to Charteris, he frequently criticised Whitlam's appointments and policies and would complain about what happened at cabinet meetings, completely violating cabinet confidentiality. Given that supply couldn't get through, there were three options to move forward. Option A, revote the House of Representatives. Option B, revote both the Senate and the House of Representatives. And option C, revote the half of the Senate that had been sitting for 4 years and didn't have to contest election back in 1974. Option C was the best for Labor and gave them a chance of governing again up until the 1976 election, but Kerr conveniently left that out in his letters to Charteris and said that there were only two options. He speculated about who was going to resign and, for example, said Frank Crean was on the verge of retirement, but in reality, Crean wouldn't go on to retire for 2 more years. Kerr said that the Liberal Party was in control of the Senate, and it wasn't. It was split evenly. Now, none of this sounds like a go-between between the Prime Minister and the Queen, but rather a guy who has it out for the Prime Minister and wants the Prime Minister gone. Now, if this wasn't bad enough, Charteris' instructions to him are very damning too. Charteris basically directed Kerr to the legal advice of a Canadian constitutional law expert, Eugene Forsby, who happened to be friends with Charteris, might I add. Forsby covered Commonwealth constitutions and had written about Australia, arguing that in this unique supply situation, the Governor-General had the power to sack the Prime Minister. But there was one slight problem. Forsby wasn't Australian, and his coverage on Australian law was riddled with errors. I'm not a constitutional expert, but in Australia, Section 13 of our Constitution explains the process of half-Senate elections, which is what Gough Whitlam wanted. Forsby completely missed this part of our Constitution, and so it was bad enough that the Queen's Secretary gave our Governor-General legal advice, but he gave him faulty legal advice. Kerr went ahead and indeed sacked Whitlam and appointed opposition leader Malcolm Fraser as caretaker Prime Minister. An election then took place between the two, and Fraser smashed Whitlam. And if you ask me, whether or not Kerr sacked Whitlam, the blocking of supply was the end of him. But that doesn't make the sacking justified. Afterwards, Charteris wrote to Kerr saying no other course was open, and he was widely praised for his action by the royal family, a huge violation of royal neutrality. I'm going to close with an article written by John Pilger in 2014, who interviewed senior CIA officials who worked during the 1970s. More than one of them alleged that an assistant director described Kerr as, quote, their man, when he was Governor-General of Australia. Thanks for watching. As you can see, this is the video I've been most passionate about. For years, this dismissal was taught completely wrong in Australian schools, and these new documents released last year changed the way we ought to understand the event. We're back to China next week, and we're back to the 1970s as we hone in on the beginning of the Sino-US relationship. We can't wait to see you next time for our next venture into a fascinating part of history.